Okay, hello. Today I am going to look at Frank Norris's Octopus and give you my brief review of this novel. And let me just come out and say it, this is one of my favorite novels of the turn of the century, one of my favorite American novels, and certainly my favorite novel by Frank Norris. Now, of course, Frank Norris had a very tragic career. He died around the age of 30. He only wrote 4 novels in his life. Now, The Octopus was the first of 3 planned novels that were going to look at the life cycle of wheat. The first of these novels, The Octopus, was going to be about the production and, to a certain degree, the transportation of wheat. The second novel would be about the trading and buying and selling of wheat, and that novel was published. It's called The Pit, and it's about the Chicago and the elevator, the grain elevators there. And I never read that book, actually, but so I guess I can't say this is my favorite novel by Frank Norris. He may, maybe there was another, maybe I'd like The Pit more, but it'd be hard to trump The Octopus in my heart. And then he wrote that one, The Pit. And then the third novel was going to be about the distribution of wheat, particularly in a famine-stricken area. And I don't know if that was going to be set in Asia. I know there's a lot of famines in Asia in the 19th century due to colonialism and the impact of colonialism on Asian economies, or maybe it was going to be in Europe. But that would have been his epic of wheat had he finished it. And unfortunately, tragically, he never got the chance to, but we do have 2 of the 3 novels. The Octopus is really a wonderful example of naturalism. We see a community of farmers, some rich, some poor, but nevertheless a community torn apart and destroyed and devastated by external forces, particularly the forces of the market and in particular the forces of the railroad. But in another way, it's also just the force of history, and this is something that is told to the farmers again and again, that you basically can't stop history, that the railroad is the future. This is how grain is going to be distributed. You're tied into the system. You want to get your grain to market, you're going to have to deal with the railroad. And automation, centralization, conglomeration, this is the future, and the small farmers, even the large farmers, are not going to survive this dramatic transition in the American economy and in the American wheat production system. We're given a wonderful cast of characters here. They're all fairly memorable. It's really a striking group of people. They're mostly quite likable, and this is a real contrast to McTeague, where the characters are all severely flawed. These characters, even the rich ranchers, are fairly sympathetic people, and you do see them trying to form this community in, I believe it's the San Joaquin Valley. It doesn't really matter. It's in California. It's in a wheat producing area, and it's tied to the railroad. In fact, that's why the people came there and settled there, was because of the railroad initially. Now, one of our main characters is named Magnus Derrick. Even his name connotes kind of an imperial aura to it. He's all known as the governor often. He's the owner of a large ranch, the largest in the area, called the Los Muertos Rancho. And he's the dominant economic force in the town, except for the railroad. His 2 sons are Lyman Derrick and Heron Derrick. Heron Derrick is kind of the one doing the day-to-day workings of the ranch. Lyman Derrick has gone on to be a lawyer, and he's going to be a great traitor to the family, eventually siding with the political forces and the economic forces that destroy this community. There's other farmers. The most important of these is Buck Annixter, who to me is one of the great heroes of American literature. He's got one of the greatest character arcs. He's got these anti-heroic elements, but he can also prove to be very heroic by the end of the novel. He dies very tragically. He learns to love. He's got everything you kind of want in an optimistic story. But he's very hard and cold and capitalistic in the start of the story, very kind of hard-nosed, and he warms over the course of the novel under pressure of the railroads. And as things get rougher for them, he actually becomes a much more human character. And so Buck Annixter, one of the greatest people in American literature, one of the greatest characters in American literature, I should say. His ranch is called the Quiensabe Ranch. Now, there's a girl that works on the ranch named Hilma Tree, and she's like the dairy girl, and Annixter falls in love with her, and she's kind of one of the figures that warms Annixter. Some of the villains of the story, the overt villains, one is Genslinger, who edits the Bonneville Mercury. This is the newspaper that's mostly a propaganda organ for the railroads. Even the name of the organ of the newspaper, the Mercury, suggests its connection to the railroad and transportation and mobility. And then the kind of the legal representative of the railroad, which is the PNS, the Pacific and Southwestern, PNSW, I think it's called throughout the novel, is S. Behrman. Now, he's got a bit of a comical end at the end, and that's one of the, I guess, the faults in the novel. In the end of the novel, he's on a train full of, or not a train, a ship full of grain, and he's literally buried in grain. And the symbolism is clear that even the people who think they command the system are eventually swallowed in by it. But it's a bit too obvious, and it kind of comes off a bit comical and unrealistic at the end. You see him trying to fight to climb out of this pile of grain as more is falling on him, and he's eventually drowned in it. Now we have another character back on the ranches, a guy named Presley, who is a very kind of poetic figure. He's trying to write a great epic of the West. He's in a sense very much like Norris himself, and through him we see the failure of romantic celebration of the farmer against progress. And he's kind of a representative of like the working man, and he ends up writing a great poem where he's celebrating the working man and the farmer. But the end result of his character arc is that doesn't get us anywhere. That doesn't get us power, and that doesn't help them achieve anything in this struggle for survival. And there's a dramatic scene at the end of the novel where he stands up to fight against the railroads and to organize the masses, and he gives this great speech about American history and American exceptionalism and the plight of the working man. And it just falls on deaf ears because he's talking to farmers who know very well that the fight is kind of futile, and just rhetoric is not going to get you very far. So that's kind of he's presented as a failure, although he is a rather sympathetic character. We have another character called Vanamee, who is really kind of the rural mystic of the area. He's a sheep rancher, and he's more tied to the land itself. And he comes off as just kind of this, really like a rural mystic, a guy living on the land and in touch with the land. And unlike the farmers who are, as likable as they are, they're still capitalists trying to profit from the land. It's Vanamee who has this, he idealizes the land a little bit more. Then a few more characters to talk about. One is Dyke. Dyke was a railroad engineer who gets fired from the railroad, and then eventually buys some land and starts to raise hops. Because the price of hops is going up, he is screwed by the railroads as well, and eventually becomes a terrorist and is hunted down. And he's kind of a tragic figure at the end, but he's driven to terrorism by what happened to the railroad. Essentially what happened is he banked on the low price of freight for his hops, which we need to get to market, and then when the price of hops went up, the railroad jacked up the price of the freight, basically to take all the profits for themselves. Dyke was left destitute, the hops are wasted, and he becomes a terrorist. And another group are the Hoovens. The Hoovens are a family of German immigrants. They think they work on the Derrick Ranch. They're tenants there. And as the land gets taken over by the railroads, they are pushed into homelessness. Hooven dies in actually an armed conflict with the forces of the railroad. Mrs. Hooven and Minna Hoover go to San Francisco to make a living. Mrs. Hooven and their young child, who is, I think her name is Hilda, basically they become homeless and beg for food. Mrs. Hooven dies. Hilda is found and sent to an orphanage. Minna Hooven, the older child, becomes a prostitute. So that's kind of the brief overview of the characters, and there's a lot of them, but it's a long novel. You can see this is my collection of Norris's work, Library of America, of course, and like the Octopus is as long as all the other content in this book combined. It's over 500 pages here. But yeah, those are the main characters, and then there's other ranchers. Now, I don't have time to talk about the whole plot of the novel. I think I sort of already gave you the idea of it. Essentially, you have ranchers, I should say, who have kind of had to have a few bad years and gotten a little debt and a little bit of trouble. but they're looking forward to a good bumper crop, and these things kind of go in cycles, and they're expecting a huge bumper crop that's going to pull them out of debt. Some people are hoping to pay off their debts. Some are hoping to, save enough for the future, and like people like Dyke are trying to start a new life. So there's a lot of optimism as the novel opens for this upcoming harvest. Now the railroad proceeds then to take this away from the ranchers step by step by step. And they do it really in two ways. The first is by manipulating the freight rates, because as the value of grain goes up, they raise the freight rates basically to take the profits for themselves. The same thing they did to Dyke, they did to these wheat ranchers all the time. So that's the one thing. The other thing they do is take advantage of the fact that they own a lot of the land near the railroads. And this goes back in history to the Homestead Act, because the Homestead Act is known for giving farmers who went west land, like 160 acres if they settled it. But it also gave a lot of land for free to the railroad companies, especially the land near where the railroads were built. And then farmers came and used this land, and they ended up being squatters, essentially. But often they were promised that when this land would go open for sale, they'd get first dibs on buying the land. Now, over the years, of course, the farmers would develop this land, put farms there, build homes there, and really make it valuable, fruitful land. And because that land was then more valuable, the railroads would, when they finally sold it, would sell it for a huge profit, sell it for 20, 30 times what the railroad really got it for. In some cases, they got it for free initially. So the railroad was not only exploiting them by their freight rates, but exploiting them by charging, charging them for land that they themselves improved, and charging them, justifying that because the land was improved and more valuable. And this basically pushes most of the farmers into desperation. They organize a militia to struggle against this, especially when evictions come down the line. They struggle against these evictions. They're armed. There's a battle, a short little, like a skirmish. It takes like 1 minute, but Buck Annixter dies, Mr. Hooven dies, and a few other ranchers die, and this basically shatters the organized resistance of the ranchers. Now, they had other ways of trying to resist too. They tried to buy politicians. They tried to plead. You have Presley trying like the moral argument using literature. So you have a lot of characters trying different things, but it all fails. And this is really Norris's point in this novel, is that nothing can succeed in fighting against the combination, against the railroad. It's impossible, and it's almost like a force of history. And this is the kind of feeling you get also when you read Jack London's work, especially things like The Iron Heel, or I think Iron Heel is the one most clear in my mind, but Martin Eden to a degree too, where just there's these overwhelming forces pushing people, and the individual struggling against this can't do much. But even Norris is even more pessimistic, because he doesn't even think combination, unionization, organization by the ranchers can do much to stop what the railroad is trying to do. And then the final third of the novel is simply the rapid decline of our characters. Some, like the Magnus Derrick, just becomes depressed. He has enough land, he's kind of rich enough, he can sort of weather it. But the Hoovens fall into despair and poverty, and one of them dies on the streets with his little baby. It's really one of the more horrific moments in American literature I've come across. Annixter, of course, dies. We really don't know what happens to Hilma Tree out of this. Presley goes on with his life somewhere else, just moving from this area. So this community is devastated. That's the end result. We assume the wheat keeps going. In fact, there's even a lot of hinting in the novel that the national market is going to be overcome by an international market, even larger and more powerful than that of the national market dominated by the railroads. So there's this ominous overhanging the entire novel. So we have a quote here that kind of gives a sense of what this novel is trying to say. Aren't you ever going to learn sense? Don't you know that cheap transportation would benefit the Liverpool buyers and not us? Can't it be fed into you that you can't buck against the railroad? When you try to buy a board of commissioners, don't you see that you'll have to bid against the railroads, bid against a corporation that can chuck out millions to our thousands? Do you think that you can bid against the PNSW? End quote. And that's Buck Annixter in a meeting of the ranchers, basically saying resistance is not possible. Resistance is futile against the railroad. Now, he eventually joins in the struggle because he has really no other choice, but he starts out the novel quite pessimistic about their future. Now, the title of the novel, The Octopus, refers really to the railroad trusts that dominated the American West in the late 19th century. Now we're given a picture also of just a world in rapid change due to technology and this kind of broader capitalist market and various innovations. We see again and again the signs that this farming economy is in transformation. It's everywhere in the novel, and it's something that Norris is almost obsessed with. And there's a he's particularly conspicuous in the description of the technological transformations taking place in the ranches. Right? But at the same time, especially with the railroad, but at the same time you have descriptions of collective efforts during plowing season that show kind of old American values of cooperation and rural solidarity. There's a barn raising scene. There's also a scene in which they work together to kill all the jackrabbits, which of course are horrible for the crop. So they have they breed like rabbits, of course. So they have to like wipe them out once a year, and that becomes a really community event. So what we see here is a community under threat of external forces. But what I find most striking in this novel, especially in the first half, is how fearful the ranchers were of the railroad. The language that runs through this novel is sometimes that of a horror novel. Okay, so this is in the early part of the novel. At such moments, she saw very plainly the galloping terror of steam and steel, with its single eye, cyclopean red, shooting from horizon to horizon, symbol of a vast power, huge and terrible, the Leviathan with tentacles of steel to oppose, which meant to the ground to instant destruction between the clashing wheels. A Leviathan with a heart of steel, knowing no compunction, no forgiveness, no tolerance, crushing out the human atom with soundless calm, the agony of destruction sending never a jar, never the faintest tremor, through all that prodigious mechanisms of wheel and cogs. Now, in the face of this, we get three responses, essentially, that maybe four, I'll say four responses to the railroad. One is that given up by Magnus Derrick, which is you fight with reason and argument and morality. You stick to your moral guns. You don't become corrupt. And he's the one who wants to resist buying a politician or buying the rail board, because this would be to just be as bad as them. So he thinks reason can do it. And he's very aristocratic in his attitudes, and he doesn't really understand the way the capitalist world functions. There's another character, Osterman, who really wants to resist with all force, and he's more of a in a figure that he's not a socialist, I don't want to say. There are socialists in the novel, though. But he believes really resisting with all force. And then Annixter, who has this fatalism to him. And these are, in a sense, all logical responses, but all of them fail to really accomplish the goal of the ranchers, which is to achieve, their independence, right? And to, keep their life going as they built it. A fourth response would be, I guess, the moral or the poetic, kind of the romantic response, which is represented by Presley, who is a poet. And I guess if I want to push a little bit more, there's actually a fifth response, which is presented by a character named Cedarquist, which is innovate along with the beast. Work with the octopus, because the benefits are around the corner for you too. Right? Yeah, it might suck now, but think of the global market. Think of the markets in Asia. Think of what the future that technology and the global market can bring for us. Yeah, you're going to be exploited, but there's a kind of a broader, open global market. Now, I don't know how much we should take that seriously or how much Norris took it seriously, but he does present it in the course of the novel. In the second half of the novel, when the characters face their defeat, it's a very, very long and drawn-out defeat. It's about 2/3 through the novel when they have the major battle, which basically ends the ranchers' resistance. And then we're given over like 150 pages of dreary imagery of devastation, of broken families, of broken lives. And the imagery switches from that of the malevolent railroad to wheat. And this is very, very fascinating, I think, artistically. Is the railroad did its job. The railroad destroyed this community, and what's left is wheat. And wheat is an organic thing. It's of the land. It comes and goes. It's eternal. And so as we see characters giving up the political battle against the railroad, which is squeezing them to death, it's the wheat that goes on and on and on. Though through action, both political and productive, the farmers of the San Joaquin Valley do form a culture of resistance. And I think there's some symbolism here about the culture of resistance that's embedded into these people and the wheat, which always comes back. And the character that really didn't have a really central component in the first half, character Vanamee, plays a more important role in the second half of the novel, at least as a symbol of this internal resurgence of life. And that's where the symbolism of wheat comes back again and again and again in the second half. So as the novel ends, S. Behrman is killed in this ship delivering wheat to Asia. The ranchers' community is devastated, and he tells us the railroad has prevailed, the railroad has won. And so he ends the novel with this pessimism, but this is how he has one more thing to say in the last page. And then we get this, quote, "Men, motes in the sunshine, perished, were shot down in the very noon of life. Hearts were broken. Little children started in life lamentably handicapped. Young girls were brought to a life of shame. Old women died in the heart of life for lack of food. In that little isolated group of human insects, misery, death, and anguish spun like the wheel of fire. But the wheat remained, untouched, unassailable, unfilled, that mighty world force, that nourisher of nations, wrapped in nirvanic calm, indifferent to the human swarm, gigantic, resistless, moved onward in its appointed grooves, through the welter of blood at the irrigation ditch, through that sham charity and shallow philanthropy of famine relief committees. The great harvest of Los Muertos rolled like a flood from the Sierras to the Himalayas to feed thousands of starving scarecrows on the barren plains of India." Right, so there's kind of an internal reality of the wheat. Now, just a few more things to say about this. I think Norris is also talking a lot about the end of the frontier. He certainly would have been aware of the discussions of the consequences of the end of the frontier. Norris himself wrote essays talking about the need for a literature of the West, which may have been itself a response to the end of the frontier. For Norris, it was simply not a matter of the emergence of civilization, but the slow triumph of capital, the institution over the individual. And if we look at the whole of his work, we find that Norris continually comes back to this power of external forces, whether it's habits or family or greed. And in this, it's much more institutional, the institution of the railroad, but how it all crushes the individual. And I think the critique is strongest in The Octopus because it's so brutal and remorseless. And it really doesn't matter how good or bad the individual characters are. They're all rolled over by the railroad. And also the backdrop of everything here is the emerging global system and the question of America's place in that as a producer of wheat, as an imperial power and a commercial power in its own right. And we're introduced to the scene most explicitly by the character of Cedarquist, who's a shipbuilder and a merchant, and he's the one who's actually talking to the ranchers saying, you should get on the international market, right? Not just the national market. And in the end, that's actually where the wheat goes. The wheat is brought to the Asian market. So, but it's not clear whether that is any better again. But certainly Norris thinks the Jeffersonian ideal of the autonomous agrarian is done for. Now, certainly I'm just here scratching the surface of this wonderfully rich and thick novel. It has great elements about immigrant cultures. It has some interesting gender issues to talk about with some of the characters. There's issues here of socialism and anarchism and strategies of resistance. But overwhelming everything is just this narrative of the octopus itself, of the railroad, and how it systematically and remorselessly devastates this town. It's a heartbreaking read at times. In fact, the chapters at the end dealing with the Hooven family are some of the hardest I've ever read in recent years. But nevertheless, The Octopus is really a wonderful novel, and it should be read more often. It's one of I don't say this often, but it's one of these stories I would actually like to see filmed. It'd be like an interesting TV series or a movie. So if there's any producers out there, I recommend this one as something that might make for compelling drama. Even if it's a bit pessimistic and bleak at times. So that does it. So if you can go back, if you like this, you can go and listen or watch my other videos on the other Frank Norris novels. I have also looked at McTeague and Vandover and the Brute. You can also look at my other reviews of Library of America volumes and the works within them. And I have a whole podcast series in which I looked at this novel. I think I have about 4 hours of commentary and analysis of the text, which is much more chapter by chapter, line by line, kind of looking at this work, The Octopus. So I'll put the links to that below. So I encourage you to, if you're interested in this novel and you want to know more of my thoughts about it, you can look there. But that does it. So please subscribe and you'll get more of my reviews of American writers. I'm also doing a series on Philip K. Dick. I'm doing a little bit of work on some anarchist texts. So I'll be putting up other content as the spirit moves me. But thank you again for watching.